7th century, down there in Arabia, just to the right, to the east of the Red Sea, a young man named Muhammad goes out into a cave to fast and pray, as was the habit of all the pagans of Arabia at the time. And he goes into the cave during Ramadan, which was a pagan month, holy month, and he's fasting and praying. This presence comes over him. And it literally, according to the Islamic documents, the Islamic story, it's choking him, it's crushing him. He's terrified. And it demands in Arabic, it says Iqra, which is recite. And this is from where we get the word Quran, Iqran. It's the recitation. And it says Iqra. And he says, I don't know how to recite, because basically what you had in Arabia in those days was you had these ecstatic poets. And so these guys they would allow spirits to channel through them, and they would basically rap in Arabic. They would recite poetry. It's kind of like Beyonce today, if you're tracked with popular culture, right? She says, what is it? Sasha Fierce. All these pop singers now, they say they have like some spirit that they allow to take over, and when I dance, I just let it happen. It just never works. But basically, he says he was terrified. He goes, I don't want to be like he was embarrassed of these guys. And he goes, I'm not one of these ecstatic poets. The second time this presence comes over him, and it's just crushing him. It says, Iqra. And he's terrified. And according to his own testimony, he believed it was a demon. He believed it was going to kill him. And it happened 3 times. 3 times this presence. And he felt like it was he thought he was going to die. Iqra, on the 3rd time, he opened his mouth, and the first words of the Quran began to flow out of his mouth. This is the beginning of the inspiration of the Quran, the holy book that now guides 1.62 billion people throughout the earth. Okay, it's very different than the examples in the Bible where angels show up, right, and they're like, fear not, fear not. They touch him and pick him up. Hey, look, don't worship me. I'm just a servant. This thing comes up and basically tries to kill him, scares the living, whatever out of him. And then it said a couple weeks, again, Muhammad's own testimony, for a few weeks he was trembling. He was suicidal. He goes back to his wife. He couldn't stop trembling, and he believed he was demon-possessed. His much older wife, Khadijah, who was running this successful business and using him as her primary boy to kind of run the company. I think she was like 15 years older or so. She basically says, now, Muhammad, you're not demon-possessed. You're a prophet. Go with it. And basically, she convinced Muhammad to allow these experiences to continue. Filled him with, self-aggrandizement, and you're amazing and all this stuff, and you're destined to do all these wonderful things. And he bought into it. And he allowed the flattery and so forth to guide him. And thus we have today the Quran. People call this a holy book. And what's amazing is that when you look at the Quran, it's specifically, other philosophies and things, they disagree with this book. But very rarely do you have like a holy book that specifically names all of the essential, foundational revelations as described in the Bible, the self-revelation of God, and call them gross blasphemies. If you believe that Jesus died on the cross, it says right in the Quran, it never happened. It's just you're delusional. You have nothing but conjecture to follow. If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that God sent his very essence into the earth to take on flesh because he loves us so much, you are the greatest blasphemer in the world. It literally names all of the essential foundational doctrines of the historic biblical faith, and it attacks them it goes right for the jugular. It doesn't take the discernment of a log to look at that and say, that's a demon, that's Satan. Now, that's not to puff our chests and say, yeah, we got the truth, and they don't. That should give us compassion for Muslims to say, God, open their eyes. Break the blinders off. Do for them what you did for us. That's his heart. So Muhammad has this revelation. Go back to the map. He basically is very successful desert pirate / cult leader. Let's just say he did a lot better than David Koresh. And next thing you know, he dies, and his religion explodes across the Middle East. And today, this is basically the part of the world that is dominated by Islam. And, again, looking at that, we can see that little dot where it says Jur, that's Jerusalem. Knowing that that is the center of God's purposes, what's more relevant to us today, the world of Islam or Europe? How have we missed this? How has Islam flown under the radar for so long? Until 9/11, by and large, we're just like, it's just one more in a series of false world religion. Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, We just didn't quite know what to do with it. This thing surrounds Israel. This is the fountain of it's the primary source of anti-Semitism, of Jew hatred, and of this demonic desire to possess the promised land. This thing is the most significant force in the earth that is coming against God's promised plan to redeem all of creation. And somehow we've missed it. And it's like, it's not just right in front of us, it's like right in front of us. And somehow we've missed it. Now, did the Islamic Empire crush all the others? Did it crush Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece? And the answer is absolutely, completely, without a question. The Roman Empire, you go, you got to try to shoehorn it in to make it fit. And you go kind of a little bit. I was with some Iranians, underground believers, and I said, did the Roman Empire crush Persia? And they're like, no. It reached some of our borders and it came in a little bit, but it never crushed the Persian Empire. So at the very best you can say is, kind of 2 of the 3, but not really. But yet every commentary that you read, it's not even a question. The Roman Empire is that which we're looking for to be revived in the last days. And I think that the scriptures are actually just a simple glance at history, a simple look at maps tells us no, we are looking for a revived Islamic empire. And this caliphate, that's the Islamic government, this cry for the caliphate is arising throughout the Middle East. And I would say that the formation, the revival of that empire is in process right now. We're not there yet. ISIS is trying to do it. I think they're going to ultimately fail. I think that others will rise up and fulfill that longing in much of the Islamic world for Islamic Sharia law, for the Islamic government. But we can clearly see the landscape as described by the prophets coming into focus. And these things can happen fast. We're not there, this year is not the year, but we can see it coming into focus. We can see it just on the horizon coming into play. Now, beyond the nature of its rise, scriptures reiterate because it talks about the nature of its demise. So in verse 34 and 35, while you were watching, the rock was cut out, not by human hands. It strikes the statue. We've already read this. And it crushes them at the same time. So not only would this empire rise and crush all the others, but when the kingdom of Messiah comes, when the Messiah returns and destroys the kingdom of the Antichrist, Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece would all be destroyed at the same time. Now again, if the Roman Empire were fully revived today and Jesus returned, Yeshua comes back, establishes his throne in Jerusalem, Babylon, Medo, Persia, and Greece would not by virtue also be destroyed at the same time. It just wouldn't work. On the other hand, if the Islamic Empire were revived today, when Jesus came, the kingdom of God came and crushed that kingdom, then yes, Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece would all be destroyed at the same time. It's very simple. It's really not complicated. Again, there's a much larger global map of the lands dominated by Islam. Does Satan know Bible prophecy? Satan is quite familiar with Bible prophecy. He knows that Yeshua is coming back to set his throne in Jerusalem. It's like we've been waiting for some religion to pop up out of nowhere in the last days, some new age thing that's going to unify us. Oprah's going to send out the email and everyone's just going to sign up overnight. And this is it. It's just going to come out overnight. Satan has been at work for the past 1,400 years, spreading his tentacles throughout the entire region, all around the throne of David, saying, no. It doesn't take much discernment to see that this thing is already in place, and those spidery tentacles have worked their way all over the earth. Now, again, I'm talking about Islam. This is the danger of this, is we need to separate the spirit of Islam from Muslims. I'm the Islamic Antichrist guy. No one's going to accuse me of being soft on Islam, right? But I want to be clear, the majority of Muslims that live around you, that you know and work with, the majority of them are not terrorists. And there's a lot of rhetoric in the believing community that says, like, all Muslims are the same, they're all terrorists, this and that. Listen, there are a lot of voices that are trying to spread fear and hatred throughout the body of Messiah. But we are the body of Messiah. We want to be realists. Yes, there's a lot of people that are Muslims and they're great and all of a sudden they turn, There's no question about that. But listen, there is no room in our midst for hatred or fear. God loves Muslims. Later today, I'm going to share some stories with you of Muslims coming to faith, some of the things the Lord's doing in the Islamic world. It's amazing. It is so amazing. And I'll tell you, my favorite people in the world are Muslims that come to faith in Yeshua. They're so, you talk about someone that will encourage you, that are happy to lay down their lives, that love him so much, that are willing to pay the ultimate price because they love him. And I hope that, I can round out my time here by helping you to fall in love with them as well, because they need our prayers and they are suffering. And yet they're right at the forefront of what God is doing. In fact, looking at that map, they are at the forefront of the Lord's, I shouldn't use this term because it harkens to something in Uganda, but they are at the front of the Lord's resistance army. In terms of what Satan is trying to do in the earth, they are at the front lines of what God is doing, and the warfare is intense. Now, beyond some of these things that we've looked at, you have this, I think, fairly profound hint. In Daniel 2, verse 43, it says, just as you saw, now it's talking about the feet, the final manifestation of satanic empire. And it says, just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people that make up this final empire will be a mixture, and they will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Okay, so there's this repeated statement, mix. Now, this is a portion of the book of Daniel that was in Aramaic, and this is a particular verse which is fairly cryptic, and so all translations have it a little bit different, and it's kind of a riddle. It's a little bit of a riddle. Well, here's what's interesting, is that in the original language, the word mixed in Aramaic is Arab. And so if you simply look at the original Aramaic language, you simply look at the verse in its original language, basically what it's saying is, just as you saw the iron Arabized, mixed with baked clay, so the people will be Arab. And we're not reading some word that sounds like, the word in the original Semitic languages, the Arab peoples were the mixed ones. You have the passages where the Lord says to, the children of Ishmael and Esau, don't mix. Don't mix with the desert pagans. The biblical definition of holiness is don't mix. Don't mix this and that. And he tells them don't mix, but they mixed. And they became known as the mixed ones. It's actually the opposite of holiness. Some translations you'll see, it'll say like the Arabs filled the desert floor. Another will say the mixed multitude. And so there's no twist on the words here. It's just right there in the original language. The people will be Arab. They will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. And the reason I think this is a hint is because it's awfully darn similar to this other example in the book of Daniel, where you had the handwriting on the wall, mene, mene, tekel, perez, and Daniel comes and looks at it, and he says he sees the word perez, which means divided, and he sees that as a divine hint, and he says to Belshazzar, the king after Nebuchadnezzar, he says, listen, your kingdom is about to be divided, perez, and it will be given to the paras, which means the Persians. So he sees the word perez, and he says it's going to be given to the peoples, the paras. Even as this divine riddle was given to Daniel that explained basically the peoples that were about to come and defeat Babylon, we're given this hint back in Daniel 2, which says that this final empire, it will be an Arab empire. And it doesn't mean that everybody that's part of it is ethnically Arab, and it doesn't mean that Arabs are bad or that God doesn't like Arabs. He's just pointing to the primary nature of this kingdom. Islam always has been an Arab supremacist force. It exports Arabism all over the world. Why do they speak Arabic in Iraq? Because the Islamic conquest went out. Why do African men and women all over North Africa have to name their children Arabic names? Why can't they name them African names? Well, they can, but by and large, in the Islamic context, it's expected that it would be an Arabic name. Islam has an Arab supremacist really foundation to it. It always has. Not just Arab supremacism, but really 7th century Arab supremacism. And thus the laws largely hinge around 7th century Arabic culture. Beyond that, we're told that in verse 41, that the kingdom would be a divided kingdom. This is actually an overriding definition defining this kingdom. In that you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay, partly of iron. People go, what does that mean? What is the clay in there? And there's like so many different explanations. Well, it says it will be a divided kingdom. It's partly weak, it's partly strong, and it will be divided. So this final kingdom will be divided. Well, again, the Roman Empire, you people say, well, you had the Eastern and the Western, but really that was like for a couple hundred years out of its 1,500-year existence. That didn't define the Roman Empire, unless you want to say, the revived Roman Empire will be divided. But really, Islam, from the very beginning, you had this divided nature of Islam. You had the Sunnis and the Shia. The Shia were those that believed that the successorship of Muhammad would be carried out through his relatives, and then the Sunnis were those that believed it would be carried out by his friends, the Sahaba, the companions. And they've been divided. And so today, throughout the Iraq War, you turn on the news, and the news says, sectarian violence today broke out in Baghdad. It's sanitized, sectarian violence. Basically what that means is Sunnis blew up a Shia mosque. Shia blew up a Sunni mosque, right? It just means Muslims are killing Muslims, or they're killing Christians or whoever. But that we just try to, we don't want to say it has anything to do with Islam or whatever. It's just sectarian violence. But basically, this has defined Islam from the very beginning, this clash between the two. ISIS wants to wipe out the Rafidis, they call them, the Shia in Iran. It's interesting that at the very end, we think the Antichrist empire is going to be so united. At the very end, in the very last days, they're there in the land of Israel. They're actually killing each other. Ezekiel 38:21 says, I will call for a sword against him on all my mountains, declares the Lord. It's talking about the armies of the Antichrist in the land of Israel. Gog in Ezekiel 38, by the way, is the Antichrist. That's a whole other subject. I'll just throw that bomb out there. Every man's sword will be against his brother. It's talking about the armies of the Antichrist in the land of Israel, and their sword will be against his brother. In Zechariah 14, it says, on that day, men will be stricken by the Lord with great panic. Each man will seize the hand of another, and they will attack each other. Now, that's sort of a divine thing that God's doing, but the point is this. This division of the final empire will be manifest right up until the bitter end. They'll actually be killing each other. Islam, the various factions are happy to sort of unify if it's for the purpose of wiping out Israel. But ultimately, that unity is very short-lived. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that sort of thing. Which goes back, by the way, to the beginning, because from the beginning, the Lord declares the end, right? Go back to the Torah, go back to the beginning. All of the things that conclude in the book of Revelation are laid out at the very beginning. So in Genesis 16, verses 11 through 12, the angel of the Lord says to Hagar, talking about the birth of Ishmael, "You're now with child, and you'll have a son. You'll name him Ishmael," which means the Lord hears. "The Lord has heard your misery, and then he will be a wild donkey of a man," speaking of Ishmael. Muhammad, by the way, believes he is a direct descendant of Ishmael and talks about that. "And his hand will be against everyone, and his hand and everyone's hand against him, and he lives in hostility toward all of his brothers." So this division, this conflict of Ishmael being against his brothers, it was prophesied from the very beginning. And then Daniel says that the kingdom of the Antichrist will be divided. This thread of division is consistent from the very beginning right up until the very end. Again, the Roman Empire doesn't really fulfill that description of the divided empire. The Islamic Empire is and has always been divided. Now I want to step beyond just beyond mere geographic crushing and dig a little deeper and get into cultural crushing. So I would argue that this kingdom would crush more than just geographic borders, but it would extend into culture, languages, religion, and all of these things. So Daniel 7, we're skipping forward to chapter 7. This is now the chapter that has the vision of the four beasts. And it is a reiteration of Daniel chapter 2. Instead of using the imagery of a statue, it's using the imagery of four beasts, but they're the same. And in speaking of the fourth beast, the fourth empire, it says this: "After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there was a fourth beast, terrifying, frightening, very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims, and then it trampled whatever was left." You know, it's like my 4-year-old son. He gets the cake, he eats it, and then he tramples the crumbs, whatever's left. And then after he steps in them, he picks them up and eats them because there's some left. He devours the residue with his iron teeth. And then he says, "What's for dinner?" You're like, "What? We just had dinner and cake." He's like, "I'm hungry." So, on the other hand, the Roman Empire, okay, so does the Roman Empire fulfill the criterion, the description of that which devours wherever it goes? Well, people always say, well, this clear, you read the commentaries, they say this clearly describes the Roman Empire because they had really, their military was bad and they crushed. But the fact of the matter is, yes, they had good military, but when they conquered peoples, it was basically, the Roman Empire was basically this. It was a giant revenue collection system so that the people back in Rome could live fat and sassy. I mean, this is really all it was. They built roads. They built infrastructure. They established laws. They built aqueducts and so many things so that the people would be prosperous and send their money back on these nice, smooth roads back to Rome so that they could become homosexuals, fat, and end up committing suicide. It's basically, anyway, we won't go there. We'll just skip that for now. The Roman Empire is known as a nation-building empire of ancient history. They're not known for being a crushing, destructive force. They're known specifically for adding all these things: the infrastructure, the law, the roads, the order. And they allowed their subjects to maintain their language and their culture so long as they tipped their hat, made the offering to Caesar, and gave the taxes. You keep doing that, everything goes smooth, right? They donated their taxes. And in fact, much of the Roman Empire, by the way, was overwhelmed by Greek culture. They weren't a culturally supremacist force. They were a revenue-collecting force. And they were very different than many ancient empires in that sense. During the first century, Herod's temple, Judaism was practiced. There were some restrictions. But the Jews, they were in so many ways like the modern American culture. They celebrated their tolerance. They celebrate, oh, look at this temple in Jerusalem. Look how tolerant we are of our subjects. They loved the fact that they let the Jews go on and practice their religion. Yes, they put some restrictions on it, but they celebrated the fact that Judaism continued, and such was the case in many other nations where the peoples were conquered. Islam, on the other hand, fulfills this description to a T of that which crushes and devours, and then whatever is left, the residue that's left, it devours it. So here's the age of the expansion. During the time of Muhammad, you have the black. He conquered all of Arabia. After he died, you had this explosion into sort of the maroon brown throughout the Middle East, and then within another 10, 12 years, it expanded all the way over to India, all the way up into Spain, Portugal and Spain, and up into even France a bit, up into Europe. I mean, it was explosive in the regions that it was able to conquer. And then it continued up into Asia Minor, Turkey, up into Europe, the Balkans, and that whole region under the Ottomans. But really, just within just a few quick decades, it exploded throughout what was the heart of the ancient believing community, the ancient church, whatever words you want to use. The cities that were the major missionary sending cities of the ancient church, Alexandria, Egypt, Antioch, Ephesus, they were crushed within years after Islam burst forth. They were destroyed. There was very little left. Within 4 years after Muhammad died, 1/3 Christians were killed, slaughtered. People keep asking, they say, well, is ISIS representative of, the early conquests of Islam? And the answer is absolutely. What Muhammad did and his earliest followers is identical virtually to what ISIS is doing. They would sweep into a city. They didn't say, oh, well, here's an opportunity to, get revenue, get taxes, let them keep practicing their religion. No, they would level a city. They would wipe out all of the men. They would take the women, 30,000, 40,000 as slaves back to Mecca. They would take the children as slaves. They would desolate areas. It was just like a massive bulldozer spreading across the Middle East. And when they didn't see the opportunity, the way the Roman Empire would collect revenue is they would establish order and allow the people to be productive, and they would collect the revenue. The way Islam collected revenue is they just keep expanding and crushing and taking the booty, the plunder, the spoil, and just keep going and expanding, and then establish themselves over these areas. Within the next 10 years, 1 million Christians were exterminated, wiped out. In less than one generation, the ancient heart of Christendom, of the early church, was crushed. Within 100 years, 50% of global Christianity had come under Islamic subjugation. And that doesn't mean it was wiped out, but it was reduced to residue. You look at the nation of Turkey today, Asia Minor. This is where you had the ancient 7 churches. This is where you had Antioch down in the southeast. These were cities that were the heart of the ancient church, the home to some of the apostles as they were sending out missionaries all over the earth. And today you have roughly 73 million Turks. You have about 5,000 believers in that nation. Think of those numbers. They're still there. And half of them are, Korean missionaries nowadays. I mean, in terms of native Turkish believers, the numbers are small because Islam is swept in and erased and crushed and devoured. And then what happens? How many years later, ISIS comes in, and what do? They start eating the crumbs. They take these communities that have been struggling, they've been there, but they were a minority, and they wipe out the residue. And this is the nature of Islam. It is a crushing, devouring, they erase culture. You had in Afghanistan, you had the ancient Buddhist statues. I'm not a big supporter of idolatry, don't get me wrong. But they carved the things out of rock. I mean, you got to give them some. They carved it into a mountain. And what did the Taliban do? They got out the dynamite, ba-boom. And they erase previous cultures. We were just last week in Sultanahmet. The Hagia Sophia was once the largest church in the world. Beautiful. I mean, the thing is huge. You go inside, and it's like you could fit this whole sanctuary inside the place and then stick a couple more on top. It's just huge. And this thing was built so long ago. The story is actually, I love telling the story. in the same way that Messianic congregations often practice an element, of liturgical, structured worship, from the prayer books and this sort of thing. And so many evangelicals, this is a new experience to read prayers from a prayer book. But there's beauty in the Siddur, in the liturgy. And in so many ways, much of Eastern Orthodoxy is similar. They have the liturgy, they have the structure. Well, in the Hagia Sophia, in this ancient church, the beauty of what was created for the purpose of worship. We largely, as evangelicals, messianics, whatever, we worship with song, with noise, and sometimes we get out the flags, and there's a little bit of color and so forth. But the ancient Christians, they use the incense and the sounds and the colors and again, I'm not supporting iconography, but just the icons and all of the mosaics, and everything was intended to usher you in to the experience of worship. They went for all of the senses, the sights, the sounds, the smells. My wife is severely allergic to incense, so we can't even walk into a Eastern Orthodox church because she'll get a sinus infection sort of thing. So I'm like, well, that pretty much rules out. There's so many evangelicals in modern times that are converting to Eastern Orthodoxy, and I'm like, we never would do that because my wife would die. But there's a story where the Russian Tsar sent these emissaries out, and he said, I want you to go to visit Mecca, to visit Rome, and to visit Constantinople, and decide what religion we're going to embrace. I mean, imagine that as the Russian Empire. And they went to Mecca, they went to Rome, they went to Constantinople, and they went to a service that was in the Hagia Sophia, and they came back and they reported, and they said, basically, I'm probably botching it, but because it's so poetic the way they said it, and they said, we went in, participated in the liturgy, and they talked about the sounds of the choirs and the hallelujahs and the incense, and they said for a few hours we were transported. We didn't know if we were in heaven on earth. They said, truly, God dwells among men in this place. And the whole Roman Empire converted to Orthodoxy because of the beauty of the worship that used to take place in the Hagia Sophia. Well, of course, when Mehmet the Conqueror came in 1453, what do? They take this ancient church and they turn it into a mosque. They rip the cross off the top. They stick the moon on the top. And today, it's a museum, but basically the Muslims still are turning it into a mosque again. You have inside, over a lot of the former Christian symbols and so forth, that's the name of Allah in Arabic, just these huge, kind of just gaudy, plaques placed, Muhammad, Ali, just sort of placed over everything. That's like, it's like a wife gets divorced, and the new husband moves into the house, and he just takes a picture of his face and just glues it over the family picture, over the old husband, I'm the new guy, it's just hokey. It's and that's kind of what it's like. You go in there, and it's just like, oh, Muhammad, this is ours now, but this is the nature of Islam. They replace, they crush, they rip off the crosses. You look at ISIS today, sweeping across the Middle East. They get to the churches. What do? They rip the crosses off. This was actually in Albania. And this is like the moderate nation when we gave Kosovo over to Serbia gave Kosovo over to Albania. But, of course, we've seen the pictures of ISIS ripping the crosses off and putting up the flag of ISIS, which declares what? There's no God other than Allah, and Muhammad is the final messenger of Allah. Basically, what's the creed of the Antichrist? What's the theology of the Antichrist? John the Apostle said in 1 John 2:22, this is the spirit of the Antichrist. This is the liar. He denies the Father. He denies the Son. There's no God other than Allah and Muhammad. It denies Yahweh. It denies Yeshua. And it replaces them with Allah and Muhammad, right? And it places this Antichrist creed, this flag, right on top of the churches. There's the old cross. They rip it down. They rip off the bell. They put up the flag of ISIS with the Shahada on it, this Islamic creed. The ancient Assyrian statues, again, you know, I'm not trying to support idolatry, but I find it fascinating to go to some of these museums. They get out the sledgehammers, they erase, they crush culture. Islam fulfills the description of the devouring beast to a T, wherever they go.